So we are now going live on YouTube as well. So hello everyone on YouTube. One more to go, Instagram. Perfect. I think we are all, there's too many screens for me to look at this end. Perfect. Right, we're up and running. So guys, how you going? I hope you're all doing well. I hope you're warmer than we are here. It looks beautiful and sunny here in the garden behind me, but trust me, it's freezing out there. It's one of the reasons why this region is such a good region for making wine, is because of those really nice, cool evenings. And this time of the year, we start to get really quite chilly. So normally about now, what are we, late April, start of May. So usually we've still got a little bit of fruit on the vine. We've still got our Shiraz out there, a little bit of Cabernet, but majority of it is harvested. In some years where it's a little bit colder than this year, we actually harvest later than Tasmania. So a lot of people don't realise how cold we actually are. But yeah, quite a cool little region. So guys, I'm Jeff. Welcome to the Tractorless Vineyard virtual wine tasting. For those of you who haven't heard of Tractorless Vineyard before, we're a small boutique winery down the Southern Highlands. We run the vineyard all biodynamically, which means we don't use any pesticides or herbicides. So biodynamics is essentially organic by default. It's an old Steiner philosophy where about 100 years ago, when the Industrial Revolution came through, a lot of Austrian farmers started finding they were getting some diseases and problems in their vines and in their animals. And so they went to a famous academic at the time called Rudolf Steiner and asked him, hey, what's going on? Why are we having these problems? And he came up with a philosophy which is essentially based on the way they did things before the Industrial Revolution. So farmers used to run more than just one crop or one set of animals. You know, they had a more permaculture way of running their farms. They also used to plant everything according to the phases of the moon and the stars. So the whole biodynamic principle is essentially going back to that. You know, it does come with this, I guess, this feeling of spirituality and hippiness because of the moon and the stars. I'm a hardcore scientist. My family are quite hardcore scientists, but I think that because when you're out there doing biodynamics, you're thinking about more than just the grapes. You're thinking about the soils, the animals, the insects, you know, the type of grass in the vineyard, you know, all these sorts of things. So I think because we're paying attention to a lot more in the vineyard, the result is a more holistic way and everything becomes healthier. We get better soil structure, we see less disease, we see less pests. And so I actually think that, you know, from a scientific point of view, a lot of biodynamics is really just about using natural systems to run the agriculture. And it's also more about actually paying attention to all the things. You know, before biodynamics, I'd walk into a vineyard when I was consulting to big companies and all I cared about was the vines. I looked at the vines and the grapes. I told the viticulturists what I wanted and didn't want, and that was it. You know, the grass was all herbicided, they were all sprayed. We did so much work to the vines to make them what we wanted based on just the vine. Whereas now I'll walk into a vineyard, I'm looking at the types of grasses, the soil structure, the animals, the insects there, and I'm changing those things in the grapes that I wanted to change before. But rather than just going out there, for example, and spraying for insects, I go, okay, why do I have insects? And we come up with an idea to fix it. So one of the unique things we do in Tractorless Vineyard is we actually run sheep through the vineyard for the entire growing season. And that means we use the tractor about 60% less, and that's where our name comes from. And the original reason for getting the sheep was actually because we were having a caterpillar problem in the grapevines in the vineyard. And the philosophy says that if you're having a caterpillar problem or an insect problem on your land, it's because you don't have enough mammals on that land. So you're out of balance. So we introduced the sheep originally for the caterpillars, Yes, it's reduced our caterpillar problem, so which is great, but it's also solved a huge other problem for us. So one of the hardest things for organics and biodynamics is controlling the grass in the vineyards. It's really, you're normally having to come through and cultivate them, which really upsets the soil structure and is a lot of work. For traditional ways, they herbicide it, which we don't want to do. And so it's actually a very expensive part of the whole process. And we brought the sheep in, and yes, we lost a lot of grapes along the way whilst we were trying to work out how to manage the sheep. But now they manage all the grass for us. They're helping us with our insect control. You know, they actually help us with some other jobs in the vineyard, which we'll talk about a bit later. So it's, you know, it really changed for us anyway. It's changed the whole concept and the whole way we do organics and biodynamics, because all of a sudden, you know, we've taken something organics and biodynamics that's highly labor intensive and usually a lot more expensive to run, and they're actually now our cheaper vineyards to run purely because of the sheep. Plus we get the extra income of the sheep as well. So it's sort of, you know, really been game changing for us. So that's Tractors Vineyard. I've been making wine. Jeff the winemaker, I've been making wine now for probably about 30 years, maybe a bit less, say 20 years, 22, there you go, 22, 23, something like that. I finished year 12 and then I went straight into winemaking. It's all I've ever done, so it's all I know. Hopefully I don't bore you guys too much, because I can get sidetracked and talk about winemaking a lot along the way. So let's get into the fun of it. Let's taste some of these wines. I hope you guys have like a nice cheese platter, some charcuterie in front of you or something like that. I get photos after I do these sessions. I get photos afterwards of everyone, what they have in front of them. And I'm jealous because I have nothing in front of me except for the wines. But maybe later I've got some private sessions doing some private tasting. So maybe later on I'll get out some charcuterie and cheeses. So the first one we're going to taste today is our Tractors Vineyard Sauvignon Blanc. Now you guys don't get to see the labels, so I'm going to have to show them to you. Some of you who've got the earlier sent out packs, on the tasting notes, I didn't put the vintage, but all the more recent ones do have the vintage. So if you've missed the vintage, the Sauvignon Blanc is our 2016 Sauvignon Blanc, and you'll see it's from our sustainable series. So we have two series of wines. We have our sustainable series, which is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And then we have our creators series, which looks like this. And our creator series is not 100% off our biodynamic blocks. So that's blocks that are in conversion, or some of our growers. So Shiraz and Cabernet, it's way too cold in the Highlands for Shiraz and Cabernet. So we work closely with some growers up here in the hilltops. And when we work with growers that are not off our vineyards, we put it under the creators series. And so we really wanted to define what's biodynamic and what's not. So the first one we go look at is our Sauvignon Blanc 2016 off the sustainable blocks. So Sauvignon Blanc is a wine that I actually normally not a fan of. So I find that Sauvignon Blanc for me, you know, a little bit too much fruit in your face. I find it a little bit overpowering and whoa, too much. And so I make our Sauvignon Blanc in a fumé style. It's a style that originates in France, in Bordeaux. It's for New World winemakers like myself and New Zealand and America. A fumé style means a barrel fermented or barrel aged Sauvignon Blanc. I love these styles mainly because it just really mellows out the flavors, so you don't get that real intense fruit in your face all of a sudden. It's just by having the oak in there, you get a lot more mellow flavor, and then you also get these nice layers of complexity from the oak afterwards. One of the other interesting things we do about this wine is we actually do a double pick. So we pick half the grapes at around about 9% alcohol. So we call it Beaumet. In winemakers speak, we're talking about the sugar level, and we use, there's hundreds of different scales on how to measure sugar, similar to how to measure temperature. You know, you've got degrees Celsius or degrees Fahrenheit or Kelvin. Well, for sugar, it's the same. winemakers will generally use either Brix or Beaumet. I'm going to talk about Beaumet. The reason I use Beaumet is because basically 1 Beaumet of sugar, when it's fermented, will equal 1% alcohol. So that's just an easy conversion. So we harvest half of the Sauvignon Blanc at 9 Beaumet, which means it's about 9% alcohol. That's where we get that really nice, crisp, fresh acids, those zippy sort of lantana-y flavors of the Sauvignon Blanc. And then we harvest the second half at about 12% alcohol, 12 Beaumet. And that's where we get those more tropical, passion fruity characters of the wine. And when you look at that, you can see both those flavor spectrums in the wine. And what I love about Sauvignon Blanc, that Fumé style, is it's just really mellowed out by that oak. It's not overpowering. It's not smashing you in the face. It's like a lot more mellowed out. It's also got those really nice layers of complexity in there afterwards as well from the oak, and a little bit softer. And that's, for someone that's not a big fan of Sauvignon Blanc, if I'm going to drink Sauvignon Blanc, this is a style for me. And I like those more chilled out, mellow styles. And something you will realise as we go through the wines more and more is that Tractors Vineyard is all about the wines that I want to make and the wines that I want to drink my way. So I just hope you guys like the way I do it, because it's all about what I want. So it's being a little bit mean, I guess, towards everyone else. But I make wines for really specific styles. So I don't make a Sauvignon Blanc for the hell of making a Sauvignon Blanc. I don't make a Sauvignon Blanc to be on trend or anything like that. I love if I'm going to drink a Sauvignon Blanc, I love a more Fumé style with the oak, so I make that style. And it's exactly the same for all our wines. So that's our Fumé Sauvignon Blanc. Nice and fresh. Good passion fruit, good lantana-y, crisp flavours as well. Now, the Southern Highlands is probably really well known for Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir. It's probably my pick of regions for Pinot Gris. Everyone always asks me, what's the difference between a Gris and a Grigio? And so I decided to make the difference. So we've done a Grigio and a Gris. That's them there. We're going to look at the Grigio first. Everyone does always ask me the difference. Grigio is the Italian way of making it, and Gris is the French way of making it. So they have very different winemaking techniques and also very different philosophies on wine. So we're going to start with Grigio. Now, Grigio, again, sorry if you didn't see it, again off our sustainable label. Now, Grigio, because it's made by the Italians, and the Italians, everything, the wine is all about the food. So if you think of Italy, a lot of maritime climate, probably a little bit warmer down there. So they're trying to create a really zippy, steely wine, really crisp acids, freshness, great match for seafood. And that's, in fact, one of my favourite matches with our Pinot Grigio is those really nice little South Coast oysters, those sweeter ones. Those South Coast oysters, nice and fresh with this Grigio, beautiful match. So the Italians, to get that freshness, they harvest it a lot earlier. So a good way to remember, Italians always in a hurry, first people to harvest the grapes. So they harvest it at around about that 11 to 12% alcohol, so a lot earlier. And that gives you that nice crisp acid. The other thing about the way they make it is the Italians are not afraid of oxygen at all. So when I make a really traditional Italian way of doing it. So when I get the juice in from the press, I actually bubble oxygen through, or get a bucket and bucket it over the top of the tank until the juice goes brown, and then I ferment it. And that helps you get that really nice steely palate, and it helps you get that, you'll see when you taste it, it's like a really nice green apple-y sort of character to the wine. So when you have a look at that, you see a lot of fresh, crisp acids, that green apple, and that's that Italian style. Really fresh, clean. I mean, that's a lovely, lovely drink to go with seafood. And, I try and make our Grigio in a very Grigio style. And when we taste our Gris next, I make that in a more Gris style, more French style, because I want them to really represent what their styles are meant to be. You can imagine you've got all these styles in between as well. So that's our Pinot Grigio. Really nice and crisp, great with seafood. Get that really nice green apple-y, steely palate. You can imagine perfect with seafood. So next we're going to try our Gris, and one of the most amazing things you'll see between these two is how different they are. So the Pinot Gris, so Gris is, the Grigio and Gris are both made from the same grape variety, the Pinot Gris variety. Pinot Grigio, which is the one we just had, is the Italian way of making it. This Pinot Gris is the French way of making it. Now, the French philosophy is a little bit different. They're making a wine for the point of just being a wine, whereas the Italians are trying to make a wine to match food. The French are trying to make a wine for the wine. So they're trying to create a soft, round, voluptuous style of wine. Now, Pinot Grigio and Gris, these are both from the exact same vineyard, same block. So they're just made with different winemaking techniques. So the first thing you'll see when you pour that into your glass, the first thing you'll see is a huge color difference to the Grigio. And what you'll see is it's got much more of a bronzy color to it. And that's because when we're trying to make that true French style Pinot Gris, and to get that big voluptuous style, we need to let it ripen a lot more. And so we're usually, a Pinot Grigio is at that 11 to 12% alcohol. A Pinot Gris is usually about 13 to 14% alcohol, so a lot higher. It's about 2 or 3 more weeks of ripening on the vine. And as Pinot Gris grape ripens, it starts to get a bit of color to it. So Gris means grey in French. And so the vines, the grape bunches actually get this sort of grey pink color as they get riper and riper. And so when we're making that French style Pinot Gris, we are harvesting at around about probably 13.5% for us. And as a result, a lot riper, higher alcohol, and we get that more bronzy color in the wine. So that's the first difference between the techniques between the two, is a lot later harvesting. The second difference is the French techniques ferment it a little bit warmer, because that gives you a little bit more mouthfeel. And as a result, it's quite easy to lose those crisp aromatics to the wine. And so the French, so that they don't lose those aromatics, do everything under carbon dioxide cover. So the Italians loved oxygen. The French were super afraid of oxygen. And so everything's done super away from oxygen, slightly warmer ferments, and a later harvest date. You'll see the color difference. And when you taste it, isn't it amazing how different that wine is? That is a completely different wine to the Pinot Grigio. So these, as I said before, same vineyard, same block, just different winemaking techniques, and it's created a completely different style of wine. Big, full, voluptuous, round, and fruity. That's what the French are trying to make, and then that zippy, crisp, clean, aromatic style of the Grigio is what the Italians are trying to make. Now, the confusing thing for us in Australia is, we have our Pinot, get my bottles again. So we've got our Pinot Grigio at this end of the spectrum, and then we've got our Pinot Gris, Pinot Gris at this end of the spectrum. And then you can imagine we've got all the variations of the two in between, and somewhere in the middle they cross over. So that's part of the complication in Australia. The other complication in Australia is Grigio, the terms Grigio and Gris are not defined. So they're not labelling law. So if I walk into a bottle shop and get a Gris or Grigio, it can be a bit of a lucky dip what I'm going to get. And I've worked for big companies where we make something that's probably like a slightly fresher Gris. So it's a little bit back towards the Grigio style than the traditional style we've done here. and it will go into a bottle shop, and depending on how the marketers think it's going to sell for that month, they actually label it either a Grigio or a Gris, and that's because it's not defined in Australia. So it makes it even harder for all of us when we're going to bottle shops. It is about to change though, it's starting to change. They now, I think it was last year, maybe the year before, when you enter a wine into a wine show, they actually have defined classes now. So they have a Grigio class and a Gris class. So if I was, for example, to put that Gris into a Grigio class, even though it's a beautiful wine, it'll get 0 marks. And that's because it's not a Grigio wine. So when that starts happening in the wine shows, that's the beginning of it to then eventually come through into production law, which will then eventually become label law. So eventually one day when we walk into a bottle shop, a Grigio will have to be a Grigio style and a Gris will have to be a Gris style. But I love looking at those two wines because, you know, it's a really good example of what the winemaker can do, how different those two styles are from the exact same vineyard and same grapes. So Pinot Gris, nice big flesh, a little bit oily too sometimes. Now, a few of you, I've just seen a few more people jump on our Zoom webinar. If you've not used Zoom before, welcome. And those of you as well, live on either YouTube or Instagram, you're all welcome to message in any questions you have. I'm trying to watch them all at the same time. And any questions I'll answer as we go along. So please feel free to write them down. Next, we're going to have a look at our Chardonnay. So this is our Chardonnay label. So 2016 Chardonnay. You'll notice a lot of our wines are slightly older. I'm a really big fan of bottle aging wines. There's certain flavors that you can't get any other way than bottle aging. I also find that, especially in the Southern Highlands here, that I find that it takes about 18 to 24 months of our wines to get through bottle shop. Now, I'm sure you've probably seen the famous movies, Bottle Shock, but bottle shock is essentially when we bottle a wine, for some reason, they lose all their flavour, and then it often takes a month or two, and I find in this region, it usually takes about 18 months before that flavour comes back, and it's one of those things that's a mystery in wine. You know, we've spent all this money doing research into why wines do it and what we can do to stop it. And still to this day, we don't know why it happens, or we can't explain from a scientific point of view what's happening, but any winemaker will tell you it absolutely does happen. So that's why a lot of our wines are older vintages, because I like to make sure we're not releasing them until they're ready for sale. So, you know, as we're going through all this, you'll start to know that Trackless, for me, this is a passion project. It's about producing wines the way I want to make the wines. It started in 2013, and at the time I was making a lot of the Southern Highlands wines. I was a contract winemaker, and I was doing a lot of consulting, and I still do a bit of that. And you know, I was getting a little bit bored of making the same old wines the same way. You know, commercial winemaking, you're trying to get the wine into bottle as fast as possible so it can be sold, because, you know, 96% of wine sold within 24 hours of it being purchased. So, you know, so it's very clinical sort of winemaking, and getting a bit bored of it. So I started Trackless on the side just as a bit of fun to keep me interested in winemaking, using some old techniques, some more involved techniques, a lot of techniques that lead a lot of time in bottle. And so that's where it's all originated, and that's as a result why we get these sort of styles that we do now. So back to our Chardonnay, I diverge. So our Chardonnay is a really interesting variety in Australia. You know, we went from the 70s and 80s where it was all about oak, and then it was probably late 90s or early 2000s, it was all about no oak. And now we're finding this nice balance again. So, you know, for me, I love making Chardonnay because Chardonnay for a variety, for me, it's like a blank canvas, because it's one of those varieties where the fruit flavors and the acid structure are there, but quite delicate. And anything you do as a winemaker, you can really see it in the wine. And so As a result, it's not like a Sauv Blanc. If I do something with a Sauv Blanc, yes, I can change the style. Yes, I can change the flavors, but the basic structure of it and flavors there, the fruit's quite robust, and so that pushes through. Whereas with a Chardonnay, it is strong fruit, but for some reason it's very malleable. Everything you do as a winemaker can affect it, and as a result, if you do something wrong, it's really easy to see it in a Chardonnay. But when you do it right, it's a beautiful wine. It's a wine that everyone that comes into the cellar door says they don't drink Chardonnay. And everyone talks about not really drinking Chardonnay, but it is always the biggest selling wine across Australia, biggest selling white wine across Australia. It's just, I think we're all closet Chardonnay drinkers. And we get a lot of people come into the cellar door, say, oh, I don't really drink Chardonnay. But then they always end up buying the Chardonnay. So a lot of people obviously still drink it. When you taste our Chardonnay, it's definitely got that oak influence. I don't use any new oak because I find it a little bit overpowering, but I do use 100% oak. I prefer 1 year or 2 year old oak, a little bit more mellow, softened. So you do definitely see that oak in there. The other interesting thing you'll taste in the Chardonnay is you get that buttery flavour to it. And that buttery flavour actually comes from a secondary ferment. So the first ferment, we're fermenting the alcohol into sugar, probably the most important fermentation part. The second ferment is using a bacteria, and we're converting the malic acid, which is the same acid as you find in an apple, and we're converting it to lactic acid, which is the acid you find in milk. So it's a softer, creamier acid. Now, byproduct of that used to be this buttery flavour. And I think it was in the middle of the 80s, there was this wine writer who said, oh, I'm so sick of these buttery Chardonnays. And so the companies that actually produce the bacteria started selecting against this buttery flavour you get. As a result, now when I go out and buy the commercial strains of bacteria, they're not that buttery at all. They give it the acid conversion without that butteriness. So for lack of a better word, I found an heirloom variety of bacteria. It's actually a rescue culture. And I use 5% in our barrels. And that gives us just a little bit of butteriness there without being overpowering. And you can definitely taste that butteriness in the Chardonnay. And you can imagine, in the 80s when that was the bacteria we were all using. And so 100% of it, you can imagine how that buttery flavour could have been overpowering. So Chardonnay, I ferment it about 80% in oak and about 20% in stainless steel, but then it's matured for 12 to 18 months, 100% of it is matured in oak. I usually I'm judged a little bit more by the dryness on the palate and then the oak flavour. Because I'm using older oak, quite often I find that the oak doesn't ever really overpower the fruit. And so when I'm trying to work out whether it's 12 months or 18 months, I just go off taste. And if you leave stuff in oak for too long, you get this sort of dryness that's there on the tongue. And so I'm tasting the barrels quite regularly. And then I reckon, probably around 12 to 18 months is usually when I always pull them out of oak. Chardonnay's one of those varieties for me where it's all about balance. And, you can see that little bit of butteriness in there. 5% is all we use for that buttery bacteria. A little bit of oak, but then you still see a lot of those really nice grapefruits and fresh sort of citrusy characters to the Chardonnay. And, if any of you there have a little bit of like really creamy cheese in front of you, something like a fromage dauphinois or something like that, try it with this Chardonnay. I reckon it's one of my favourite matches. The creamy cheeses just brings out that butteriness in the Chardonnay, but it kind of brings it out in such a way that melds with the cheese and makes the fruit characters of the Chardonnay stand out as well. So it's a beautiful match, one of my favourite matches for Chardonnay, for our Chardonnay anyway. So that's our Chardonnay. Probably one of my favourite whites, actually. you know, and I have to agree with some of the comments that it's you know, it does get a bad rap sometimes, and I don't know why. I think because it is a blank canvas, you know, if I'm an oak lover, or if I'm a that butteriness lover, or a fruit lover, whatever it may be, as a winemaker, I can really dominate that wine. Luckily for you and me, I'm more of a balance lover, so I like to see a bit of oak, I like to see a bit of butteriness, and as a result, that's how our Chardonnays turned out. But you know, it can turn out any other way as a winemaker. Rosé. So first thing you'll notice with our rosé is we've got these little bottles. So the idea when I first bottled the rosé in these little bottles, they're 500 ml bottles. And the idea was 2 people can drink a bottle over lunchtime and still be under the limit. Unfortunately, I can't get these bottles anymore. So the next time that we do the rosé release, it's going to be in bigger bottles. So unfortunately, one of you, the 2 people, is going to have to be over the limit. The other thing you'll notice is the colour. I don't think, it's not a bad angle. It's quite a dark rosé, which is definitely not trendy at the moment. At the moment, what's trendy are those really light coloured Provence style rosés. Something you'll probably notice in a lot of our wines is they have a lot of texture to them. I'm a huge fan of texture. I love to smell the wine, taste the wine, but I also love to feel it in my mouth. And to get that texture in the rosé, I need to leave it with the skins for a longer period of time. And as a result, it's a darker colour in the rosé. Now, a lot of people don't realise if I take a red grape and I squeeze it, the pulp and the juice inside is actually white. So to make a red wine, I need to ferment that with the skins to extract all the colour. To make a rosé, I leave it with the skins for a period of time until I get the colour or flavour or texture that I want. So generally, a lot of winemakers are going to colour spec, and especially at the moment where light rosés are the trend, they're probably spending about 1 or 2 hours with the skins before they're pressed off to get that really light colour. As I said, I'm a huge fan of texture, and so to get that colour in our rosé, or to get that texture in the rosé, it usually takes me about 10 to 12 hours with the skin. So I'll be tasting the juice every now and then whilst it's sitting with the skins. And again, when I start feeling a nice little bit of furriness on my tongue, that's when I press it off. But as a result, we get a slightly darker colour. Now, this is 100% Pinot Noir rosé. Don't be scared of the dark colour. One of the biggest things that we find in the cellar door is people see the dark colour and they immediately think sweet. This is a bone dry rosé. Again, this is made the way I love it. Nice and dry, nice bit of furriness and texture in it. And then you get those really beautiful sort of strawberry shortcake sort of characters from the Pinot. Again, this is originally made. You can sort of see down there the deck behind me, not looking super inviting on a day like today where it's so cold outside, but in the middle of spring or summer, it's beautiful out there on my deck. And I'll often be out there eating charcuterie or cheeses, and this rosé, perfect match for a range of like meats and cheeses as well. And it's got the softness and creaminess like the Chardonnay to go well with cheese, but it's also got that sort of robustness from the Pinot, which get that nice strawberry character, which allows it to really cut through and work well with cured meats as well, which is why it's my sort of antipasta plate wine, I guess. Beautiful, soft, dry rosé, my sort of style of rosé. Reds. So we're ready for reds. So for us down here in the Highlands, I don't know where you guys are. I know a lot of packs this week have gone up to Queensland and some in WA. Even had people asking in Amsterdam and UK to get some, but unfortunately we're only in Australia. So you guys might have some warmer climate. So you might be enjoying a nice chilled white or rosé. Down here, freezing. I think just looking at our temperature gauge over there, maximum temperature down here today was 9 degrees. And so I'm happy to go into our reds. And probably a good place to start is our Lost Flock. Now you'll notice different labels. These are our actually older labels. We've updated them all now to the ones with the sheep on them. The Lost Flock, I was sitting in front of the fire drinking a big Barossa Red, which I love. I love a big Barossa Red. I love the complexity and the soft velvety tannins and the long sort of raspberry aftertaste, but I usually find them a little bit heavy and I can only have a glass or two before they're too much. And I wanted to create a wine with, you know, the same sort of flavors and textures and tannins, but that I could drink the bottle of in front of the fire. Not that I'm telling anyone to drink a bottle of wine, but that's how I created the wine. So I came up with this blend that we call the Lost Flock. There it is again. So the Lost Flock is essentially a Grenache Shiraz Mourvedre blend, so GSM, but it also has Merlot and Petit Verdot in it. And this is just a really nice, soft, easy drinking red. It's got that long, lingering raspberry aftertaste. You know, you could just imagine sitting in front of the fire, just casually drinking on this. It's probably also the wine that I take the most often to a dinner party or a barbecue. And that's because, you know, some people like Shiraz and some people like Cabernet and some people like Merlot. The great thing about a blend is someone can usually always find a flavor they like in that wine. And so it pleases the most people. So it's the wine I take to dinner parties and things. Oh, nice soft bit of chocolatey character in there from the Shiraz. Really nice, clean raspberries, long raspberry aftertaste. And, you know, just a great everyday drinking red. I call it the Lost Flock because of the sheep. Now, we talked a little bit about the sheep at the beginning. The sheep we run now are called Hampshire Downs. So we had a lot of trial and error. And we, you know, at one stage we had these electric wires underneath the grapevines just below the bunches. And so the sheep wouldn't eat anything, which worked great until the electricity stopped, and you'd be surprised at how much of a vineyard sheep can eat in one day. So eventually all these trials and losing fruit and blah, 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 we ended up with a variety of sheep called Hampshire Downs, and we lift our vines a little bit. So the Hampshire Downs are a little bit shorter and squatter, so they don't reach as high. They're also what you call grazers, not roamers. And what that means is they'll be looking down and eating the grass, and they won't look up to eat any of the grapes or the leaf on the grapevines until they've run out of grass. So as long as you're running them through the vineyard, they won't touch the vineyard. Now, once a year, and I mentioned this earlier as well, so once a year we do a process which is called leaf plucking. So normally we have hordes and hordes of people come to the vineyard and we actually pull off all the leaves around the bunches. And the idea is we're trying to get the light to contact the grapes, and that way, one, it helps us with disease, but it also helps us with a little bit of flavour development as well. So normally we pay teams of people to do this, but what we worked out was if we actually leave the sheep in a block so that they eat all the grass, and then 2 days later at the right time of the year, so when the berries are still really hard and green, so they don't like to eat the berries, then they actually will eat the first 2 leaves off the vine, and that will actually expose the grapes for us. And so they're doing that job for us as well. California is actually doing some amazing research into using sheep in the vineyard, where they're putting the sheep in for, you know, a few hours in the morning, and the sheep don't want to be in the shade. So they're only eating the sunny side, morning side. And so the leaves are staying on the afternoon side. And so the hot afternoon sun is not burning the grapes. So it's amazing. And, you know, we'll over the next 5 years start trialing some of this stuff as well. So, you know, it goes back to me saying at the beginning how the sheep have changed our lives. It's another example of how they're saving us so much labour in the vineyard, and all we're doing is running the sheep through. And I grew up on a sheep farm, so it's great to have sheep again. So the other thing with the Hampshire Downs, they're called roamers. So what that means is, you know, you see like merinos, they're all in a flock together, and you end up with these sheep camps, and you end up with these tracks all over the paddock. Well, roamers don't stay together. So the Hampshire Downs are spread out across the whole vineyard, which means we don't get compaction. We don't get those sheep tracks. We don't get the camps. So it's a nightmare when I go and shear them, because there's always two somewhere that I miss. I don't know where they're hiding, and it's always a different two. But so when you come out of the vineyard, you always see two really woolly sheep. It's because they're the two that got missed when we were shearing. So they're called Romas, and the barrels in the winery are stacked according to variety. So I have all the Grenache together, all the Shiraz together, all the Petit Verdot together. And because this wine, the Lost Flock, is a blend, the barrels are all over the winery, and it reminded me of the sheep all over the vineyard, and hence the name, the Lost Flock. That's my long story to get to the the reason we called it that. So the other thing you'll notice is 2014. So again, slightly older. Like all our reds, I really love a slightly aged red. We'll talk about a bit more aging wines when we get to the Cabernet. But there's just flavors and textures and softness that you can't get in wines without. So you can get softness in wines when you bottle it early, but you lose something else. You're losing some sort of texture, you're losing some sort of flavor. And so to get that softness with all the complexity and with all the layers and interest and texture, the only way to do it is bottle aging. So that's our Lost Flock. Next is our Shiraz. Now this is probably actually, from a winemaking techniques point of view and flavour point of view, it's probably actually the most Australian wine that we make. And Australia was famous from Shiraz, for making Shiraz. That sort of put Australia on the map to an extent. It's where I began my winemaking. My first job when I finished school was working for Clonakilla down in Canberra. They are famous for making cool climate Shiraz. So I couldn't not make a Shiraz. It brings back so many great memories of when I started winemaking, the flavors, the smells in the winery. So this is probably made similar to maybe 90% of red wines in Australia. It's de-stemmed. It's fermented without the stems for about 3 weeks. It's pressed off into oak for 12 to 18 months and then into bottle, and then 12 months in bottle and it's released. So really quite simple winemaking. It makes just that really nice, soft, round, delicate style, cool climate Shiraz. And if you drink a lot of cool climate Australian Shiraz, this is pretty much what you would expect to get. Got those really nice, chocolatey, plummy sort of characters, soft, round palate. What I love about cool climate, and in particular the Hilltop and Canberra regions, is the Shiraz from those regions. It's this beautiful structural backbone to them, and that's one of the reasons I work with the growers there for our Shiraz, because it's way too cold in the Highlands for Shiraz. And then you get that nice little sort of white pepper spicy finish to it. And it's just, to me, it sums up cool climate Australian Shiraz. It's funny, I sit down with my dad, and he's used to, he grew up, he's now late 80s. And so, he grew up drinking those Barossa, those big fleshy Shirazes, which, as I said, I love those Shirazes, but I just find them too much. And so when I show him this, he's like, it's a little bit light, isn't it? But that's what is so beautiful about cool climate Australian Shiraz. It's just so light and delicate, yet it's got such great structure and layers of complexity and a long lingering aftertaste and that little bit of spice. And, there's still so much happening in those cool climate Shirazes that I think can get a bit lost in a warm climate Shiraz like Barossa, McLaren. They're phenomenal Shirazes, but they're big and you can lose some of that finesse to them. So this is probably the most Australian of all our wines. Good memories come back drinking that. Next, we're going to look at our Cabernet. So again, this is our old style label. Now, I really am a big fan of aged Cabernets. And I was lucky enough when I was studying at uni that I was early enough for winemaking not to be trendy. So I think there's only about 15 of us at uni. And the person teaching us about wine tasting, he's one of the masters of wines. And he had rescued from a skip from a pub that was closing down in South Australia, a 375ml bottle of McGill's Burgundy. So that's Grange, or that's Penfolds before Penfolds, the McGill's vineyard. And we tried it in our tasting class. So it was 1956, so it would have been like about 20 years ago I tried it, and it just blew me away. And the flavours, if I describe the flavours of this really old wine, the descriptions sound terrible. Composting guava and composting fruit and soy sauce and fish sauce, and you think, oh, that doesn't sound good, but it just, the way it balanced those savoury, funky flavours with the fresh fruit flavours, and the way they balanced just like sold me on aged wines. It was amazing. It was beautiful. So when you age a red, there's a few things that happen and a few problems you have. When you're aging a red wine for a long time, there's two things that happen. One is you lose your fruit. So slowly what's happening, if you've got your fruit levels here when you bottle the wine, and then your savoury levels sort of probably off the charts if they're at all. And over time, you sort of see this. And, you know, if you think about the premium time to drink it is when you've got that nice balance. And, you know, if you go a bit over, that's fine as well. But eventually what happens is all your fruit flavours disappear. And so that's, you know, when you taste the wine where the fruit flavours disappeared, then, you know, that's probably had it from an age point of view. So that's one of the problems we have with aging wines. The other problem is they call it cracking up. And if you've ever tried a wine that's cracked up, it is the best description for it. You know, when you put a wine in your mouth, how the flavours and textures sort of fill the whole mouth? Just imagine right through the middle, there's this sort of crack. And in that crack, there's no flavour or no texture. And that's kind of what they mean when they talk about a wine cracking up. And it really does taste exactly like that there's this crack down the middle. Now, the reason for that is the tannins in the wine. So if you can imagine, I've got a young Cabernet and I've got these short chain tannins. So you know those in a young Cabernet, you sort of have like it's a little bit chalky, grippy, those tannins that grip in there. So they're short chains. And as we age that bottle of wine, those short chains join together into a long chain, and a long chain is soft and velvety. So that's one of the great things that, you know, that happens as we age the wine. That's how we get that softness. And the problem is, though, let's say we start off with 100 of these short tannins and they've joined together into these nice, soft, long tannins. We've gone from 100 tannins to 50 tannins. And then those long tannins join to a longer tannin. And so we've gone from 50 tannins to 25. And then what happens is there's actually not enough tannin in that wine to hold the structure of the wine together. And that's why we get what's called cracking up in the wine. And as I say, it literally tastes like this crack down the middle of the palate. It is crazy. Like, I remember the first time I tried a wine that's cracked up, and it is exactly like that. They've had it. So the flavors were sort of there, but it didn't taste any good because of this like missing bit in the middle. So Bordeaux is famous for wines that age really, really well. And they developed this technique they call post-ferment maceration. And what that means is that they leave the wine with the skins and stems for a really long period of time. And what that does is two things. The first thing is that for some reason, it just gives you this really intense fruit flavour to the final wine. And when you're making the wine, you wouldn't know it had it, because, you know, we leave our Cabernet for 18 months with the skins before we press it off. So it's 18 months with the skins and stems. It's then pressed off into oak for another 12 to 18 months, and then goes into barrel for another 12 to 18 months. So it's quite a long process. But whilst it's in the tank and whilst it's in barrel, you don't taste any fruit. It actually tastes quite terrible, the wine. It's quite resiny and bitter from all the stems and seeds and stuff. And you really, like, the first time I did this, you just got to have faith. I called a lot of old winemakers in Australia to ask what they knew about this technique. And, I'd heard, they told me a lot of people here and had done like 2 months or 3 months on skins, but nothing much longer. There's sort of evidence, and I've heard, I guess, through urban myth and whatever it may be, and what's around that it was done longer than that in Bordeaux. So the first time we did it for 12 to 18 months with our Cabernet was like, the number of times I actually thought I'd destroyed the wine was quite big. It tastes terrible at various times. And then for some reason, after about 12 months in bottle, this fruit flavour is bang, it just comes out. And so it's way too much for me, but it makes sense because that will then age beautifully. So that's one thing with the wines, that fruit flavour. The other thing with this post-ferment maceration is in the tank, you've got heaps and heaps of these short chain tannins all floating around. And because they're on the tank and there's so many of them, they're pushed together quite regularly, so into long tannins. So when I bottle that wine, when I press it off and I bottle that wine, I'm actually bottling it with like 100 of those long tannins rather than 100 of those short tannins. And what that means is I've got more tannin. Yes, it's softer, more velvety tannin, but I've got more of it in the wine to begin with, which means as it's aging, it holds that structure a lot better. So by using this technique, we've got more fruit and more tannin, so it's creating a wine that's going to age a lot better. And you'll see when you taste it. Now, this is 2015, so this has been in the bottle now for 4 years, and when you smell it, it just still smells so young. You just get that cassis, tomato leaf, capsicum character, which is so typical of like cool climate Cabernet characters. And, when I smell that, I kind of expect to get like those real edgy, sharp tannins still, because it still smells that young. But then when you put it in your mouth, it's just got those really nice, soft, velvety tannins of an older Cabernet. Now, for me, the fruit level of that is still a bit high, and I am going to be drinking that probably in 5 or 10 years when that savoury characters come up. And I'm only just starting to see a little lick of that sort of soy saucy character in that wine. And I like to see a lot more of that when I'm drinking it. So I'll probably be drinking that in another 5 or 10 years time. It should be a wine that ages 20, 30, 40, 50 years under screw cap, maybe more. And I say should because I actually don't know any other winemaker in Australia that's made a Cabernet on stems and post-ferment maceration like this for 18 months. And so whilst there is evidence of Bordeaux wines doing this and they age really well, we don't know 100% sure that our Australian grapes and our Australian tannins are going to react in the same way. So at the moment, it's doing everything it should do, and I'm really happy at how that's developing. I've actually shown this to a lot of old school winemakers who I was actually originally talking, like Philip Shaw and those guys are talking about it. But and they now have started doing some trials with this technique just for their own purposes, because I'm really excited to try this in 50 years' time. So if we get back on here in 50 years' time, I'll probably be a hologram or something then. I can tell you whether the technique has worked in Australia. Now, I've just realised I missed our Cabernet. I missed our Pinot. Pinot, this is one of my favourite wines too. Again, it's from our sustainable series. And the Pinot is 100% off our biodynamic blocks. And Australian Pinots, New Zealand Pinots, they make it in this really beautiful sort of delicate style. It kind of reminds me of Ballerina for some reason. Layers of complexity and interest, but at the same time, they're so light and delicate. And so I love those styles of Pinot, these New World styles, I call them. Well, fortunately, whatever. Our style is not like that. Ours is a really old school, funky Burgundian style. So to make that, heaps of whole bunches, heaps of whole bunches, probably about 20% whole bunch. We leave the stems in there still. About 3 to 4 weeks post-ferment maceration. And what it creates is this big, funky Burgundian style Pinot, which is, I love that style. And as I said, I make the wines the way I want to drink them. And so that's why I made it this style. When you first bottle it, similar to the Cabernet, that it's so big and resiny and bitter that you can't drink it. So it actually spends 3 years in bottle before we release it. I'm at the 3-year mark. Just has a little hint of bitterness at the back palate. And I drink a lot of coffee. I actually like a bit of bitterness. So that's why I released it at the 3-year mark, because I find it quite attractive. The French would say, no, wait another year. So now when you drink it, it's been 4 years, it doesn't have that bitterness. It's actually softened out in the back palate. But this is my favorite wine. Just big, funky Burgundian style. You know, for me, it's an example of one of those wines where it's made specifically to age in bottle. And so you get specific characters when it ages, and you just end up with this amazingly beautiful but big and funky style of Pinot. It's one of my favorite wines we've made. Pinot, similar to the Chardonnay, where it's kind of like, it's a little bit like a blank canvas. You know, when I'm making a Shiraz or a Cabernet, the fruit flavors are really strong. And so if I make a mistake as a winemaker or do something wrong, the fruit flavors can cover it up a bit. With Pinot, they can't at all. Anything you do as a winemaker when you're making Pinot Noir is shown in the wine, so it really comes out. So that big funky style, that's a style that's designed to age. So, you know, I'll be drinking that in 20, 30 years. It's going to get that beautiful sort of forest flory, cigar boxy character in it. You know, I'm lucky enough to just squirrel away plenty of cases of wine into my private cellar. And we do actually keep, for our club members, we actually do keep a museum range, which we only put in our club members, so that people can actually experience some aged wines. Because if it's like my household, you know, anything I'm aging in the cellar can't be in the house, because, you know, you've had a few wines, and next thing in the cellar, and your good wines come out. So if I'm aging wine, it's offsite for sure. So I want that experience to come through to our club members, so our club members do actually have access to some of our museum stock, which is exciting. So one more wine to go. Last one, lucky last. So the oldest record of winemaking in the world comes from a country called Georgia in Eastern Europe, and it's dated 6000 BC. So that's 3,000 years before Egypt. So, you know, they've got a fair bit of winemaking history behind them. There's a really interesting book. It's a little bit technical, but if you're into history, it's a great book. It's called Ancient Wine, and it basically talks about how they proved the oldest record of winemaking in the world. And it was basically that they found tartaric acid on pottery shards, which meant that they knew it was from grapes, because tartaric acid is grapes are the only fruit that can make tartaric acid. And then they found grape seeds in these pottery near these pottery shards that were fat and round. Now, if I take a wild grapevine and I propagate it and look after it and cultivate it, the seeds go from it's kind of a seed shape. They go from long and skinny to fat and round. And so they knew the grapevines had been cultivated. They saw tartaric acid in the shards of the pottery. So this is the oldest tangible record of winemaking in the world, 6000 BC. Just to the north of the capital of Tbilisi is where they found it. Now, I was really lucky enough to spend 7 years consulting in Georgia. It was an amazing time, amazing wines, and they do a famous red style they call Kinsmorali. Now, I love this style. So this is my homage to the history of wine. It's my homage to Georgia. It's homage to the people and my time in Georgia. It's our Australian version of Kinsmorali, and we call it 8,000 vintages. And how to describe it? It's almost like a light port, I guess. It's like a big, robust red, but it's a little bit sweeter and fruitier. Perfect match for that American style barbecue. Great with a mature cheddar, American style barbecue, or a really dark chocolate. So they call it Kinsmorelli. It's a really famous style of winemaking in Eastern Europe. So I just got distracted because I lost connection on my Instagram post, but that's all right. So yeah, very famous style in Eastern Europe. In, I think it was early 2000s when Russia and Georgia had that little battle with each other, and Russia banned all imports of Georgian products into Russia, and it was still our biggest market was to smuggle the Kinsmorelli in school buses across the border. So it's that famous over there, and it's like a really interesting style. I love the style. I love my time in Georgia, and so that's why I had to make it here. It's not a true Kinsmorelli because it's not from the Kinsmorelli region, but it is true to style. It's what you'd expect. These wines, in theory, in Georgia, age very well. I haven't tried any really old Kinsmorellis. I've got some in my cellar, which one day I might try. But you know, it's a great match for the American style barbecue. I reckon this is the match to do it for sure. So guys, that's our wines. I hope you enjoyed it. Well, it's not all our wines. Unfortunately, I can't get our sparkling wines in, and there's a few other wines that I didn't put in the mix. We've got a huge range. So the 8,000 vintages, someone just asked what grapes we use in it. Traditionally, 8,000 vintages or Kinsmorelli is made with Saperavi. Saperavi, quite hard to find in Australia. We are grafting some into our new biodynamic vineyard. We've actually just taken over. So our vineyards to date are not certified biodynamic because we only control the vineyard, not the whole farm. And so our latest project is actually the entire farm. So we'll finally be able to certify now, which is really exciting. And that has quite a big vineyard on it. And so we'll graft over to Saperavi for it. At the same time as doing that, so our current one, we use Shiraz, Cabernet, and Chambourcin to sort of get the same style. We will be using Saperavi when our grapevines are grafted over. We're also looking at importing, and I'm working through that now, a Querry. Now, Querry is, you've seen these amphoras. Well, amphoras are like the new age version of a Querry. So Querry is sort of a bigger pottery sort of urn that actually goes underground. I think amphoras are probably around about that 500 litre mark. They're in the hundreds, whereas a Querry is in the thousands. They're quite big vessels and they're buried under the ground. So I'm looking at importing one of those as well, because my aim ultimately is to make a proper Kinsmorelli out of Saperavi grapes and made in an amphora, because I also want to make some other traditional Georgian wines like Cacciatelli and those sort of styles, but in a more orange wine sort of style. But this is very true to style. So the flavours and the textures are very similar to the ones we make overseas. So it doesn't see any oak. It's just fermented. We do a little bit of pottery here, and like amphoras in ours, and so we get very similar styles and flavours to it. Guys, that's our winemaking. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm looking to try and piece together a sparkling version of this, because we do a big range of sparkling wines. Unfortunately, it's hard to send them all out. I've chucked some links up there on our chat page. Please visit them. There's some great stuff happening there. I'd love you guys to buy some wine. We make a little bit out of our tasters, but not much. So guys, I hope you enjoyed it. Hope to see you again. Spread the good word. I hope you enjoy some wines, even though you can't get out, or you can get out a little bit now, thanks to easing up on some of these isolation things. I hope you had a lovely time, and any feedback, any photos, please send it through. I look forward to it, and enjoy the rest of your evenings. Thank you.